Hope you're all here to think about following obsessions as writers, and also with your curiosity about how these three gentlemen on the stage might think about their own obsessions. I'll start by introducing them, and then we'll get into some subject matters that might have led them obsessively in their own work. So on the far left here, on my far left, is Scott Lasser. And Scott is a native of Detroit, as many of you know, whose books include the novels Battle Creek, All I Could Get, The Year That Follows, and most recently, the moving novel Say Nice Things About Detroit. Scott cares so much about his home city that he recently traveled to LA to see Motown's beloved house band, the Funk Brothers, get their star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The blurb on the jacket of Say Nice Things asks the question, if you want to go home again, what do you do if home is Detroit? We'll see in a few minutes what Scott has to say about whether Detroit figures as an obsession for him in his writing. In the middle is Pinckney Benedict, and he's our brilliant and generous stand-in workshop leader and participant this week. He's standing in, for those of you who don't know, for the writer who got stopped at the border. And he's the award-winning author of 3 story collections and a novel, including the collection Town Smokes, and most recently, Miracle Boy and Other Stories. And his books have finally arrived at the bookstore, but I can tell you that half of them have already sold. So if you want to get one of his books, move quickly at the end of our session. Reviewer Kyle Miner described him as, quote, some kind of latter-day Chaucer meets Gogol meets Donne meets Ray Bradbury meets Albert Goldbarth, all somewhere in the back of the library. And then on my immediate left is David Lipsky, and he's a longtime contributing editor at Rolling Stone and the best-selling author of several books, including the novel The Art Fair, a story collection, $3,000, and the nonfiction books, Absolutely American, and Although of Course You End Up Becoming Yourself, A Road Trip with David Foster Wallace. And having spent the last 3 days in David's workshop, I can tell on him a little bit when it comes to obsessions, and I'm pretty sure he'll have some good writerly obsessive stories to share with us. For example, why else would a boy from Soho be drawn to spend 5 years at West Point, all for a book? So with that, I thought I'd just repeat the Kafka quote that was in the description for this session. That great quote that says, don't bend, don't water it down. Rather, follow your most intense obsessions mercilessly. And we'll start by taking a look at subject matter obsessions and then branch out from there to other ways writers are obsessive, including possibly their writing routines or choices of style or so forth. But let's start with you, Scott, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how what matters to you has directed your path as a writer.
Yeah, I think I'm obsessed with any subject matter that I can figure out how to write about. Because I can think about a lot of things I'm obsessed with that I have not been able to figure out how to write about, like skiing, for example, which those of you who know me personally know I'm sort of a committed skier, and for the most part, I haven't found a way to write about it. I think, just in context of my last novel, I think things finally got bad enough in Detroit. I mean, so bad that I felt like I couldn't not write about it. And I think where you're from, where you spend the first 18 years of your life, it has a lot to say about who you are and how you think. And I definitely feel that was the case for me. So as things kept getting worse, and there's this phrase in the language like, it can't get much worse, or it can't get any worse. That has no meaning in Detroit whatsoever. And so I just thought, stories are about trouble, and where is there more trouble than Detroit? And I think the more I looked at it, the more interesting it seemed to me. I sort of thought I knew it, and then I feel like I'm still learning. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but at some point, you just say, I got to write about this. I think it's also interesting that not that many people have written fiction set in Detroit, which is bizarre to me, but nonetheless, that's the case. I figured there was at least some open space for me to slide a book in.
Yeah, George Carol Oates, but that's been a while.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned that because I went and read Them, which won the National Book Award in 1970, which if you keep in score, that's 43 years ago. So, it's been a while. And that book very much dealt with the 67 riot, and there's been a lot going on since then.
Great. So, Pinckney, you want to pick up
Yeah.
with whatever
Yeah,
matters most to you that directs
I am,
your
yeah,
writing?
in terms of just what I'm generally obsessed with and what then inevitably becomes my subject matter, sort of Jesus, guns, and cars, although not necessarily in that order. Those are all things that fascinate me. They're all things, I wish I could, partake of the nature of Jesus. I wish I had all the guns that I wanted, and I wish I owned all the cars that I felt kind of sexually attracted to. And those are, mostly late 60s and early 70s American muscle cars. So Detroit, I grew up, when I grew up, baby, it was not East, it was Detroit that we bowed to, and and that was in the big divisions when I was a kid were you a Chevy guy or were you a Ford guy, right?
Sure.
Was it first on race day or fix or repair daily?
So were you Chevy or Ford?
I was always GM. Although I did own a 1973 Mustang with a 351 Cleveland.
Okay, because my father worked for Ford for pretty much his whole life.
Yeah. Well, Mustang. Nobody beats Mustang, but GM's cheaper.
And
Well, we could have this conversation.
And one of my good friends from high school designs the Mustang. Come on.
Yeah. Well, no. It's and then you turn the other side, and we start talking guns, and I could do that. I had a conversation about guns earlier today. It's because guns are one of those things, if you're a writer, that everybody, whether you know about, or most everybody, whether you know about them or not, eventually is going to be writing something about a gun, right? If you're an American, because you're either shooting somebody or getting shot by somebody, right, in America, if you're in a story. And
Let's hope so.
So it's particularly if you're in one of my stories. Yeah. So it's it's useful to know some goof who knows a lot about guns, because then you can just send an email or pick up the phone or whatever, and I will freely volunteer that if folks, if you have gun questions, but gun people scare you or worry you or you just don't like them, you can send me an email and I'll try to hook you up one way or another, and we'll figure out what sort of gun that person needs in order to shoot her husband in the head while he sleeps or whatever. Because I love solving those kinds of problems. I love mechanical difficulties. Cars, I'll do the same thing. Joyce, you were talking about Joyce, we were talking about Joyce, and about Joyce Carol Oates was a teacher of mine and remains a friend. And I remember getting a note from her. I'm sure the book came out a month later. A note from her, asking about what would a working man in like 1973, a guy who had a good job, not a lot of education but decent income, what would he have driven? And that email went out to all my friends, and we kind of, and in the end we decided it was a Corvette, right? That was the car that that marked you as a foreman. That wasn't, you weren't just a but it was an affordable car, but come off the line with 400 horsepower and that kind of thing. Well, anyway, so you can see what my obsessions are. And generally speaking, what I do as a writer with those obsessions is I will give them as a kind of gift to a character. That is, some unattainable, beautiful car. There's, I've got a car that starts with, it's just nothing but a description of a 1970 Dodge Challenger, and sort of every aspect of that car and what made it special. The shaker hood, the 440 cubic engine, on and on. And I give them that gift, and it makes me interested in them and want to follow them because they have something that I would desperately like to have. I give, in some cases, the title story of my most recent book is Miracle Boy, and I give that kid real faith. The kind of faith that I would literally die to have, and so that then he becomes what I wish I was, or some aspect of what I wish I was, and what I think about all the time. And so I can't stop thinking about him, so I don't have any excuse not to write the story.
Awesome. Great. David?
Pinckney said everything I was going to say.
Me too.
My obsessions are more limited, and I think they may be more functional.
It'd be hard to be less.
No, but for writers I know, often you're obsessed with the success of your peers. In fact, let me change that: the undeserved success of your peers, right? Or you might also be obsessed with the undeserved failure of your peers, right? Let's say you see someone, they've written an incredibly great book, and the book didn't go over, right? You saw them work 3 or 4 years, you knew it was great, their editors knew it was great. For some reason it didn't go over, and you think, how do I avoid that fate? Everything seemed to be working. And when you're writing in general, and this I think is really an important thing for everybody in this room who is here trying to perfect their craft and trying to learn how to write, I think that kind of obsession is kind of the one that you need to get to the point where, like Scott and Pinckney, you can talk in a very comfortable way about what you obsess about now you have a few books under your belt. We were talking about this in class, but John Updike has a great line about what you should be obsessed with, what your first responsibility is as a young writer. Does anyone know what that is? What your responsibility is? Your responsibility is to get into print. That's the obsession, right? It should be the obsession of everyone in this room. When I was younger, and as I remain as whatever age a writer I am now, my obsession tends to be, it doesn't really matter what the subject is. How can I make this sentence feel better, right? I can feel that it's good, but it can go faster, it can go better. I can feel that the page I'm working on needs somehow to be smarter. The writers who I know and who I like and socialize with, that's the basic obsession they have. It really doesn't matter what the book is, what the subject of the book is, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. What it is that drives them to get the book done, to get it done well, is this obsession actually about, this is how good I want to be, this is how good I want the presentation of myself to the world to be. And the one thing when I talk to other people who teach writing, they're often surprised by the people who come in as apprentices. That was the word that we were taught when I was in graduate school. And they're always surprised. It's a very, very difficult field. There's a lot of competition. And a friend of mine, the writer Darren Strauss, was saying, he was talking to one of his kids, and he was saying, so what are you reading now, right? And by kids, I just mean these are people who are 1 or 2 years out of college. And this person who had fought their way to get an NYU program, hard program, said, oh, I'm not that into reading. And these were students who would go home, and instead of reading or checking magazines, seeing why stories, fiction or nonfiction, worked on them, seeing how fast they were, how slow they were if they weren't working, they were watching movies and watching TV. And you are trying to get into a very difficult field. You are trying to surpass a lot of other people who want that field. And one of the things you should be obsessed with is somewhere in some desk at some very late hour, there's someone who's working harder than you. And that obsession, the obsession with how much effort that person is putting in, is, I think, one of the things that's going to make all of our work better. So.
Great. So I'm going to challenge you just a little bit, because you spent 4 years at West Point on a project, which seemed like an outlier for you when it started.
God. You rarely hear that much of a horsey breath from a human being. I could nick her too, I suppose.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So, I mean, just talk a little bit, for those that aren't just familiar with the story, about how that went, and whether there was any kind of obsession for you in that quest to understand that situation.
Yeah, I wonder how this will ring with Pinckney and with Scott. We were talking about this here a couple days ago. I was, at a certain point, I was obsessed with not doing journalism anymore. I had done it just because I wanted to have, and I'm sure you guys had this feeling too, right? I wanted freedom from my obsessions. Like, when I was writing fiction, I was just assigning myself projects, and it was always the same basic thoughts that I had to, the same museum of thoughts and visions and grudges I had to keep walking through every day. It turned out there weren't that many wings and galleries. So I was very happy to actually go and be assigned things to be interested in. But then after a few years, one wants to go back. So I was trying to quit being in journalism, and I'd agreed to do one or two stories a year for the magazine I work for. And they said, look, you can't, you've been turning down these travel stories, you have to go to West Point. To get out during the story, I told the people at West Point that I could only write an article about them if I lived there as a cadet for 4 years, basically. I knew they couldn't do that, so then I went home and I was watching television with really actually covered in fast food. So if they had seen me, I think they wouldn't have done this, but the phone rang and a very military voice said, the answer is yes. So I had to go be at West Point for 4 years. Now, it's not an obsession that I picked, right? I actually didn't like the military before that. But it was a very strange experience to have. And it was one that if you were going to have the chance to actually live as a cadet, as a 35-year-old man, you'd just be foolish not to take. Now, I ended up working very hard. I was supposed to only be there, and again, I wonder how this will ring to you guys. I was supposed to only be there for 2 or 3 years, and I thought I would leave and then write the book. But during the 3rd year, I'd gotten more involved with hanging out with the company I was in and having fun and not writing. And so, so I had to become extremely obsessed with the subject matter to make up for it. I had to stay the 4th year so I would have enough data because I had screwed up basically for the year before. And then, because there were certain things I hadn't reported, I had to make sure that my writing would be good enough and funny enough so that the holes would be known only to me. And so often you'll do kind of your best work, or you'll become most obsessive because you have to cover up an error that you've made, basically.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Well, I've just, in terms of that sort of paper tiger stuff, or whatever you want to call it, is, another thing I'm interested in is military aviation, and I've got a couple of stories in the book that are, they're not aviation, they're not sort of military stories, but they deal with military people and particularly with military aviators. And so through a friend mainly, I got to do not nearly as intense as your immersion, but I ended up doing getting some really good time on an F-14 simulator at Oceana NAS on the East Coast, and then spending a day aboard the carrier out with the Pacific Fleet, and I catted and trapped, trapped and catted. Which a lot of Navy aviators haven't even had the chance to do, so that was pretty thrilling. And then sort of the final chapter in that was getting to actually flew the back seat, or sat in the back seat of the number 7 plane of the Blue Angels, which is the Navy flight demonstration team. And we did the whole thing, man. We did the squirrel cage, and I found out that I pass out at 7.2 Gs. That we did it twice, and both times. Well,
Who doesn't?
Well, the guy who was flying the plane, thank God.
Okay.
But those guys, he couldn't care at all. I see the recording. They actually had a camera on you, and he's just laughing at me because you do this thing called the hick maneuver. And you go hick, hick. Which I thought was mean because I'm from West Virginia, and so you're doing this, and we did a simulated bombing run and then pulled up at 7.2 Gs, and he's going hick hick. He's just having fun with it, and I go hick hick hick. Then I come back up like that, and I said, and clearly I was just really, extremely disoriented. It's very weird to wake up, in a supersonic attack aircraft and think, what the hell is happening? Like, what? And so I kind of said to the guy, I said, I think I passed out. He's like, no, you didn't pass out. You're fine. Because he didn't want me to stop him from doing the high G maneuvers and that kind of thing. But you really do have to physically involve yourself in some way. And we've talked about that in my class this week. And it is, no matter what it is, just whatever you have people doing physically in your work, do those things. Because we live so much in our heads, right? We sit in front of keyboards and we type and we type and we type, and we are, we're like aliens from Star Trek, right? We think we're all up in here and great big foreheads, and we do have bodies, and when we write about bodies, you need to know, what a body does when it's employed in the thing you're writing about. And whether it's 4 years or in my case, a few days, you have to, put yourself at risk physically at risk a little bit.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised. People will let you into their lives or their jobs, and you would never think. I want to know what it was like to be a sheriff's deputy, so I just asked to ride along. Yeah, sure, come along. Couldn't believe it. So if you ask, you often get yeses.
So Scott, in the year that follows, and how you were led into writing that book,
Mm-hmm.
which is, was, for better or for worse, inspired to some degree by 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how that was for you to live into that situation so that you could progress your story?
The way that book came about is that I'm going to try to make a long story short. I got this idea when I was living here and waiting tables in a Chinese restaurant and not getting enough shifts, and I had a wife and a child, and I was starving to death, and I had a couple degrees, and I was just thinking my life should go better. So I decided I would go to Wall Street because I figured if it didn't work, at least I'd get a book out of it, and I probably wouldn't starve. And so I did that, and I got the book out of it, and I was about to publish the book, and my editor called me and said, hey, why don't you come to New York and meet everybody in the publishing house? You know, you haven't never been here, and meet the marketing people to help your book. And I'm like, great, when should I come out? She's like, well, anytime after Labor Day. My daughter's birthday is on the 9th of September, which that year was a Sunday. I'm like, well, how about if I fly out on Monday the 10th and I'll come in the morning of the 11th? So just pure randomness, the first time because I'd been working in New York till early 2000. So I flew in the night of the 10th, and that morning I was there when all hell broke loose, sort of literally. So I was thinking, God, I should really write the first 9/11 novel, because here it is. That's the mercenary way you think when you're a writer. It's like, wow, I suddenly have great material.
Yeah, we're monsters.
You're right.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really weird.
And the other thing is that I don't know if Tom Barbash is here, but he wrote a whole book about what happened to Cantor Fitzgerald. I knew a lot of those guys because I talked to them, 50 times a day, and they all got stuck in the North Tower, and no one got out. So and I worked at Lehman Brothers, which at the time was across the street, and the North Tower fell into it. So it was a good part of that day where I was like trying to get a hold of friends, and like that was a pretty fraught time, and you would not forget it if you were there. And so then I got this, I guess, obsessed with the idea of writing the 9/11 novel, and I did actually write a pretty long one, which was just like so bad that I couldn't even believe I could do it that badly. And finally, after about 4 years, I just threw it away and started over. Still was going to write a 9/11 novel, just a different one. And actually a much shorter book, and I'd like to think much better. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, just that such an experience led you. It led you to a project.
I think I also wanted to write about 9/11 where the book didn't take place in New York. I'm like the anti-New Yorker. I mean, I understand the place's appeal, but I'm not one of those people that thinks it's the center of the universe or even the center of the writing universe, although I realize all the publishers are there. And for me, 9/11 kind of happened everywhere. I mean, I got stuck in New York, and I ended up driving back here, and that was sort of an interesting experience, 2,000 miles on I-80 and 76 and whatnot, and all the people were driving rental cars. The whole road was full of rental cars going 85 miles an hour. My wife at the time was like, "You're going to get a ticket." I'm like, "No, I'm not. Look at everybody else is driving this fast, and if a cop pulls me over, I'm just going to say I'm trying to get hold of my kids." And he's going to ask me, "How come you're only going 85?" So I want to write something that didn't really take place in New York. That book just has a short prologue that does, and sort of how it sort of changed everything, because I had this idea when it happened that it wouldn't change that much, and then as I was writing the book, I decided it kind of changed everything. So.
That's great. So maybe we can talk for a minute about when you were young, and maybe before you knew you were going to be a writer, what your reading obsessions might have been as a younger person.
Me?
Any of you.
You're assuming I read as a young person?
Okay.
I stopped reading when I became a teenager, and I didn't start reading again until I was 20. And I was working in this steel plant in Detroit, which is a really lousy job. When I always hear about, like, we don't have enough manufacturing jobs, I'm thinking, those manufacturing jobs suck. Have you ever worked one? Ugh. It's like 130 degrees. There's so much noise that your head rings for, like, all day Saturday after you've been there all week. It's not fun. And I get home at night, and why do I feel like I told this story on this stage once already? Maybe I did. But I got home, and I was just, like, at loose ends for what to do, and, TV wasn't going to do it. And I picked up The World According to Garp and read that first chapter and thought, I'm going to read. And I've basically been reading ever since. And after I was like the only guy I knew at college reading books and not taking English classes, reading novels and not taking English classes. And then I ultimately, because I tend to do hubristic things, decided to write.
Great. How about other reading obsessions for either of the two of you when you were younger? Pinckney.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was a kid, I was, I really loved like Louis L'Amour and Western, like Western potboiler type things, and kind of stories of the cavalry and hard-bitten stuff. And I liked monster stories and ghost stories, and stuff. And so this nice lady. She was kind of an adopted grandmother. When I think I was 13 or 14, she saw this book, and she thought, oh, Pinckney will love this. It's perfect for him, because the subtitle was A Gothic Western. So it's a haunted house story, it's a monster story, and it's a cowboy story. She thought, I'll give this to him. Well, the title of the book is, maybe you all know it, is The Hawkline Monster by Richard Brautigan. It was not a kid's book. And so she gave me the book, and I'm like, oh, it's got monsters, it's got cowboys, and it opens up with these two killers, Cameron and Greer, and the one guy's got a big Krog rifle that I've always liked. And so I'm thinking, I'm in hog heaven. And next thing I know, like they're in bed, both of them, with this Indian maiden. And it was probably the first time I ever saw the word fuck in print. And I remember thinking, like, what has happened to my world? And I realized, like, that's all I ever want to do for the rest of my life is write, like, cowboy and monster stories in which people get to fuck. And so that became, like, I realized, it was probably my first encounter with actual literature. And so I went, literature is awesome. Like, who wouldn't spend their life making literature? And then I just went from there.
All right, how do I follow that? I'm interested by how many people who become writers, and people who I meet, smart writers in workshop programs, that they didn't start out as serious readers. And I wonder if there's a kind of gain from that. There's a funny essay that Updike wrote about what he grew up reading. And he didn't grow up reading classics. He didn't grow up reading even the more fun ones like Dickens. He said that he grew up reading just like Philip Carr and P.J. Woodhouse. And I don't know how to pronounce Nagayo Marsh and Agatha Christie. And he said that he felt that those were things, it was useful for him because those were books that made a firm compact, a bargain with the reader. I will make you laugh. I will thrill you with a diabolical puzzle. And so when it came time for him to write his own books, he was always aware of that need to make the reader interested, to make the reader entertained, beyond the idea of a classic that you have to kind of apply to read almost, right? I grew up reading comic books, and it was very funny. People didn't talk about that. That was one of the things that actually Rick Moody was the first person to break silence about in The Ice Storm. There was this whole generation of kids, and I don't know if it was as big outside New York. Did you guys grow up reading comic books?
Yeah, weird war tales.
You were one of the war.
I love weird war tales. Yeah.
Well,
The haunted tank.
No, in camp you were always a little bit anxious about the guys reading the war.
From the inside.
For good reason, too.
Good reason for it. Because we were plotting your doom. We were like, because we're looking over going, that good-looking guy, he's going to be a success unless we kneecap him now.
And did you, Scott? Did you grow up reading comics?
A little bit at camp, worried about the guy reading the, and for good reason, let's face it, right? Yeah.
I mean, the guy you worry about is the guy who masturbates to Weird War tales.
See, I thought they were all masturbating.
No. Some of us it was a purely philosophical interaction.
You
with the
say
material.
now.
Yeah. But and then when I was in high school, I picked up Great Gatsby, and when I was between comics and high school, I would only read a book if it had become a movie. So the way my parents would give me books to read was they would try to find paperbacks that had the inset 12 pages of photos from the movie, because I knew it was a good story, right? But then I was given The Great Gatsby, and there's that moment at the end of the first chapter of Gatsby when Daisy's been complaining. We would now call this a backdoor brag, right? But she's been complaining about how cynical she's become. Sophisticated, she said with a thrilling laugh. God, I'm sophisticated. And then the book says, the minute her voice ceased to compel my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. And sure enough, she turned to me with an absolute smirk upon her lovely face, as if she had just asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. And the mystery you're basically trying to solve in high school is, why am I less popular than I know I should be? And and for me, the insincerity of the people who were beautiful and beloved by the school complaining, somehow the truth of Fitzgerald saying that was not sincere, that seemed like something I wanted to do. So
That's great. So I thought we might turn for a few minutes to obsessions that have more to do with writing routines or habits or like that. And I don't know if any of you have discovered this fun new book called Daily Rituals, How Artists Work. It's great to pick up here and there when you just have a few minutes. But since Pam mentioned Toni Morrison the other day, I thought I'd share something she says about particularly her recent writing habits, and I'll share a few of these, and then we'll find out what our panelists, what it stimulates for them in terms of their own. It says Morrison's writing hours have varied over the years, but now, since the 90s, she switched to early morning hours, saying, quote, "I'm not very bright or very witty or very inventive after the sun goes down. For the morning writing, her ritual is to rise around 5 o'clock, make coffee, and, quote, watch the light come," unquote. This last part is critical. She says, "Writers all devise ways to approach that place where they expect to make the contact, where they become the conduit, or where they engage in this mysterious process. For me, light is the signal in the transaction. It's not being in the light, it's being there before it arrives. It enables me in some sense." So that's her comment. And then since Pinckney has a friendship with Joyce Carol Oates and also had the good fortune to study with her and so forth, she talks a lot about how hard she works, really. And I thought this was interesting. Given the number of hours she spends at the desk, Oates has pointed out her productivity is not really so remarkable. She says, "I write and write and write and rewrite, and even if I retain only a single page from a full day's work, it is a single page, and those pages add up. As a result, I have acquired the reputation over the years of being prolix when in fact I am measured against people who simply don't work as hard or as long." And then the commentator says, "This doesn't mean she always finds the work pleasant or easy. The first several weeks of a new novel," Oates has said, "are particularly difficult and demoralizing. Quote, getting the first draft finished is like pushing a peanut with your nose across a very dirty floor." And then just one last quick one, which is quite humorous. Gertrude Stein and her partner, it says she had many quirky things that had to set her up for her writing. Every morning, Miss Toklas bathes and combs their French poodle basket and brushes its teeth. It has its own toothbrush. And that was all part of the ritual. Miss Stein has an outsized bathtub that was especially made for her. A staircase had to be taken out to install it. After her bath, she puts on a huge wool bathrobe and writes for a while, but she prefers to write outdoors after she gets dressed. And then they go on, and then they say, "The two ladies drive around in their Ford till they come to a good spot. Then Miss Stein gets out and sits on a camp stool with pencil and pad, and Miss Toklas fearlessly switches a cow into her line of vision. If the cow doesn't seem to fit in with Miss Stein's mood, the ladies get into the car and drive on to another cow. When the great lady has an inspiration, she writes quickly for about 15 minutes, but often she just sits there looking at cows and not turning a wheel." So with that, maybe you can each speak a little bit to whatever works or doesn't work for you, or what obsessions you might have developed to avoid writing.
I just want to ask these guys a question.
Go
Do
ahead.
either of you think that Joyce Carol Oates' productivity is unremarkable? Like she said, no. I mean, okay, so
Only from within her.
only from
yeah.
her perspective.
Right,
Okay, because
right.
I am blown away by what she's able to do.
It's terrifying.
It's terrible. Yeah, it's
and
like
just to be close to it is like it's like
it'd be like trying to
being a
in a
log in a
hurricane or
timber mill or something.
Yeah,
Because I mean, she feeds on everything around her. I mean, and literally in a green room, if she were on this panel while we were sitting here getting ready to do it, she'd have been writing. She is. It is. I mean, she's doing it all the time.
I follow her on Twitter. She's like tweeting all the time. For God's
Yeah,
sake, it's unbelievable.
When she told me she was going on Twitter, that really just seemed very funny to me.
Right.
And every now and again I'll get a note from her. I'm not on Twitter, but I remember getting a note from her And it was, she was like, gun control is a big issue right now, and I know you and guns and so on and so forth. And, and I'm on Twitter, and I got the feeling like I was supposed to say something that she could then tweet out so people would be outraged at me. I was like, I don't really know.
You don't need that kind of encouragement.
It was, yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, in one, kind of wanted to take advantage of it, and but it was, but her on Twitter, that just seems kind of amazing. But so she tweets a lot?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, all the time.
Amazing. So any habits or rituals you're willing to share?
I've spent most of my writing career working in finance where I have had like zero time. So I would develop these weird strategies. Like I knew that those of you from the New York area will know these places. I lived in this place called Mount Kisco, but technically, because the way government is there is so weird, I still haven't figured it out, that I could only get the train pass for the Chappaqua train station. And that turned out to be a godsend because Chappaqua was the end of the local line. And so my danger is that I was always so tired and I would fall asleep. And then if I fell asleep on the express, I'd end up in Brewster, that would be a problem. So I could take that local train, even though it'd get me home a little bit later, and I'd write until I fell asleep. And then invariably the conductor would be like, "Hey buddy," and I'd look around. Would be like, I guess, coming to on the plane. No, I got in that train. It was jam-packed with people, and now I'm the only guy left, and I get off. And that's man, look, I wrote a novel that way. It's just page a day. You get a book eventually. So I guess my point is I try to do something every single day, and that's how I do it.
And it can be anywhere?
Yeah, I write by hand, which is, I think there are a lot of advantages to that, but one of the great advantages, you don't have to be sitting down with a computer. But my view is if it works, then it works. So what works for me might not work for you, and who cares?
Right.
I kind of think it's important not to just write one time a day. And it was interesting when in the book you were talking about that I did where I was driving around with Wallace, it was fascinating to hear that's what he did also. But I would try to write once sort of in the morning or in the crossover between like 11 to 2. Now, if you don't write, often that can go really badly. I don't know if you've had this experience, everyone here. You can have a day that's going badly. Now, if you then kick off for the day and then go the next day, what you'll have in mind is kind of the shitty time you just had, right? And so you'll go in there with a bit of diminishing spirits. What I find is that if I make sure to write a second time or a third time, often the problems that I had before are gone. Right, and then when I sit down the next day, I know I'll have a shitty first session. Right, I sometimes think of them as like in restaurant things, like the first seating, second seating. What Wallace said was that he tends to do he writes twice, or he wrote twice, and has kind of some sort of a fun, clear my mind type activity before I sit down. People I know, because you collect these things. Do you collect these things too when you guys are just reading interviews or reading stories about other writers? I was fascinated that a writer named Lev Grossman, who's the senior arts writer. He's the main book person at Time. He was writing a really great fantasy book, the first book in a series called The Magicians, and he wanted to do an adult fantasy book, and he had loved C.S. Lewis, so he loved the first Narnia book, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and he also loved the corrections, and he wanted to do a book that sounded like both of them, and so he literally had both books on either side of his desk because he knew he wanted his book to be in the middle. It was sort of a visual reminder of what he wanted his book to be like. And then people just have interesting rhythms. Like Updike said that he had to make sure he wrote at least 3 days, had to write every day because he was afraid that it was like a bicycle that you would become amnesiac about style on if you stopped doing it. He picked 3 hours because he thought people in offices, what with walking down the corridors, hanging to the people's desks, going to the vending machines, they probably did no more than 3 hours of work a day anyway. Wallace, on the other hand, said a thing which I thought was great. He said, look, I'm not that smart talking to you now, right? I'm not that smart in a conversation, but you give me 24 hours where I can do drafts and I can be really, really, really smart. And then Roth, this has always fascinated me about Roth. He said it would take him 2 years to write something. That's the actual like calendar length of time between projects. But he said what it really was the first year and a half was just writing things to find the voice he needed for the book, writing things, throwing them out, writing things, throwing them out. And once he actually had the voice, he would write the whole book very quickly. But a lot of it was just finding out what pace he wanted for the material and how he wanted the characters to sound. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything that's been said is far more useful than anything I can add. But I grew up on a dairy farm, and my dad got up every morning about 4 o'clock and went out to milk and would milk and come back and have breakfast, then go back out again, spend the whole day out till he came back for supper time. And so I grew up watching him and watching my brother, who's also a dairy farmer and who now runs my family's dairy farm. My dad is now what he calls the chief bookkeeper and mechanic on my family's dairy operation. So I grew up watching them, and then and watching their dedication to their work. And then I went to college and ended up working with Joyce really the whole way through college. And so I watched her and I heard her talk, and what she says in that interview is, it's exactly what she says to students. It's like, just do this at a steady pace and so on. And so all my life I've had sterling examples of people who understand the value of work and dedicated themselves to it, and who have done well by doing good, and so on and so forth. And it will surprise you to learn that I am a contrarian. And so it is my, I just want to, anytime I see a good example, I want to stick my thumb right in its eye. And apparently recently I've decided that I'm going to be the only guy who's ever been a successful writer who actually just didn't write. Or at least not very much. My last book, my first 2 or 3 books didn't take me that long, but this last book, was I think it was 14 or 15 years. And it's only 14 stories. So she writes a page a day. I apparently write a story a year. And I actually write a great deal more than that. And I do some other stuff that requires me to write things. But in terms of the fiction, and the fiction I actually ever send out, the fiction I ever want to show to anybody, I work very, very slowly. I'm not a and my habits are not particularly regular. In anything really. It is I'm trying now that my kids have gotten a little older, and I've got a good steady job that I'm not too worried about, and that kind of thing, to be a little more regular in terms of my writing habits. But I have not been, and largely, it's partly because if I ever did what, say, my dad did, if I ever had that kind of work habit, or if I ever did what Joyce did, what I produced would be so much lesser. You know what I mean? Like, I can always go, well, of course, they work hard. That's why their stuff's good. But if I ever did it, and then I go, well, but my stuff's not. I would seem paltry by comparison. So I've just chosen a different route of blowing it off. So don't do that. We have 2 good examples, and I will serve then as I'm the scared straight guy. Don't blow it off, or you'll end up looking like me.
That's why we put him in the middle, actually. No.
I'm the bad example.
So any other obsession-related comments anyone wants to make before we open it up to questions? Anything I didn't ask you that you were dying to say?
I'm obsessed with you.
Oh my God. Nothing I'm willing to share, clearly.
Yeah, right.
I love what Pinckney said, but it just seems like the basic thought from almost every writer is just make sure you're on a schedule. It's easier. It becomes easier. It's very much like everybody out here does some athletic thing. I'm just going to use jogging. If you haven't jogged for a while and you start jogging again, you remember having run 5 miles a day. The first couple of days will be awful, and you'll forget why it was easy, right? And then as you go, after you're running again for 2 or 3 months, it's easy. But you can't expect it easy if you've had a layover, and that's why most writers will say you have to keep doing it every day because they don't want to go through that awful period of having their leg muscles be weak. And Flaubert, who kind of set the pattern for how obsessive we now are about our prose being good, he just said the same thing everyone says, which is live like a bourgeoisie and write like a demigod. But the living like a bourgeoisie, his point would be, allows you to do that. Just meeting a schedule, 9 to 5.
See, that's why I learned to shoot, so I would never, ever have to run.
And with that, I think we'll open the floor to your questions. So we have microphones, and we ask that if you have a question and you're chosen to ask it, that you wait for the microphone to come to you. So, Mark.
So we've heard about obsession with writers, which I imagine most can identify with. What about obsession with your characters? What role does obsession have in making a character interesting and something that the reader wants to continue to follow?
I always go, by the time I finish the novel, I'm so damn sick of them, I try to kill them. Seems the way to get them out. Yeah.
But you have to start out obsessed with them, I think, because then you won't ever be interested in them. You'll start to hate them a lot earlier.
Right. Well, that happens sometimes too. But you're obsessed with their problems, or how they're going to do the thing you never figured out how to do in your own life, and then they can't even do that. And then
dig us out of this hole.
Yeah. Help.
I remember.
What did Flaubert have to say?
Alice Walker, when she was writing Color Purple, she said she got this house far from town because she wanted to have room for the characters to come speak to her. And she had the experience, she said that she had the experience actually of them speaking and dictating their parts to her. And I forget which writer this is, but they said they always felt bad because that never happened to them, right? What they were obsessed with was finishing the book and making the book work, and they always felt bad. And then they were talking to another writer who had the same thing, like, yeah, that's also never happened to me. Is that like a semi-dig out of the hole?
Yeah, sure.
Great,
No,
great,
that's
great.
awesome.
Cool. But I think sometimes we have exalted ideas about what the obsession that I think makes books go is the obsession to get the thing finished, basically. And without that, have you guys it's been interesting watching writers, and I'll just talk about like Wallace and Friends, and when they have gotten what they wanted, right? When they've been acclaimed in the way they wanted to be acclaimed, it was very hard, no matter how much they loved their characters and stuff, it was very hard for them to write their next large books. So it does seem like the obsession that drives us to get stuff done is just the obsession to have people outside feel about us, for better or worse, as we feel about ourselves. I mean, I was looking this morning to see how far back that went, and there's that great quote from, I found the quote that you wanted, from John Milton, who said, "Fame is the spur," right? He says, the last infirmity of noble minds. And then it gives us the ability to scorn delights and live longer days. And I think it's that probably that drives us. I think certainly that drives a lot of people to do the really hard work to make a book work, more maybe than the characters. Is that? Sure. Okay.
And I'd say that in our workshop, one of the things that's been so valuable about working with David this week is that we just have gotten down to the level of every word counting and how to make it better. And so I will leave here with a more obsessive view of how to handle language. And I think that's been really, really valuable. So thank you for that. Another question? Let's go to one and then the other. That would be great.
How do you handle keeping your work original and fresh?
If it is.
Yeah, that's quite the assumption.
But I mean, but really, one of my obsessions about writing is never ever to repeat anything, never to never to get sort of hung up on what I perceive as past successes, or to try not to do those things that I know I can do successfully, or feel I know I can do successfully, those things that I've done before, those things that I've developed muscle memory for, because for me it is the new thing, doing the new thing and always doing something that, not only something I don't know that I can do, but in fact something I feel I know I cannot do, that interests me and draws me on and makes me able to complete. Because otherwise, if I feel I can do it and I feel I've done it before, then I feel in a way I've already done it when I sit down to it. And so, I mean, for instance, we were talking about comic books and stuff like that, and graphic novels are now are now an acceptable form, and I literally can't draw a lick. I mean, if I drew a stick figure, it would seem obscene to you. It would an obscene parody of the human form, and you would forbid me to ever take up a pen again. And so I decided, all right, well, I was asked to submit a piece to a friend's anthology, and so my immediate thought was, I'll give him a comic. I like comic books, I like graphic novels and stuff like that. And my wife pointed out to me that this was perhaps not a particularly wise thing for a man who literally cannot draw a smiley face that does not look like it's angry and misshapen, that this was not a wise thing. And I said, it's going to be very short and it's going to be very, very simple. It ended up being 30-some pages long and this incredibly elaborate story of the war between the mountaineers and the flatlanders. Right, in which the mountaineers, the king of the hillbilly king orders his minions, and they fan out and they basically just cannibalize all the sort of weak, slow-moving flatlanders. And another obsession of mine, of course, is that war, which apparently the flatlanders don't know is going on, and they really don't think we're going to win. But so I spent a long time just figuring out how does a guy who can't draw, and I just stole from everywhere, and I used computers helped me a lot and that kind of thing. The thing actually eventually got done, and it's Sarah Bond is doing an anthology of contemporary transgressive Appalachian fiction this fall, and they took it for that, and it's been some other places. So, but it's that desire never to do anything twice. I can't bear to do things twice.
Was there still a question here?
David, I read your book, The Art Fair, a long time ago, so I can't remember it all. Except I remember. What I do remember is that when I began to read it, I thought, wow, this is what a memoir should be like. And then, of course, I realized it wasn't a memoir. But in regards to obsession, and I know part of it was true, do you think every first novelist writes obsessively what, in fact, we call today now creative nonfiction? In fact, that your obsession is so strong that I know we write what we know, but we write a little more of what we know in the first novel.
Yeah, I think that in a... I'm going to do a quote again, by the way.
Thank God. I was worried.
You guys didn't? Okay. I was always felt like obviously like in Annie. Have you guys all seen Annie Hall? So you didn't think it'd be a Woody Allen quote, right? In Annie Hall, when L.V. Singer is writing his first play, what it is actually is him getting the relationship with Annie Hall right. He wants a different ending, right? So in that one, Annie Hall doesn't leave him, but she leaves him. Then she walks back tentatively and say, "Wait, don't go. I love you." Joyce, when he was writing Portrait of the Artist, like if you walked by him and you pissed him off, he would then make the character based on you look really bad. And his brother joked that James's fiction was the court of no appeal, because when you're writing a book, one of the things that will drive you to make you want to write basically is that you want to settle scores, right? The obsession that I had in that book was that I had been against my will part of the art world. And so I kept thinking, once my prose is strong enough, I'm going to pay a lot of these people back. And I think that cold anger is also a really good thing. Another thing that will drive you, I don't know if this will ring true, but when I was doing the West Point book, sometimes I wanted to kick off at midnight or at 1 o'clock. I like to write at night, and I recommend that too, guys, if you haven't tried it, just because everything gets very quiet. And often if you're writing during the day, you think, what exactly am I being left out of? Like, what cool thing is happening now at 2 or 3 in the morning? You are the hottest thing going. There's nothing else happening. So I often will do a lot of, and also if you've been smoking all day or chewing nicotine gum, you are really nicotined up by then. Like you have finally reached the saturation point you want. But I would think about kicking off at 1 or 2, and I would think about, the agents who hadn't been as nice to me as I wanted them to be, or the editors who had passed up the book I was doing. And I would think, I really want to get those people, and to really get them, this book has to be a big success. And if I go to sleep now, they win. And if I stay up and I keep working, there's a greater chance of me winning. So I think those are the kinds of obsessions that will drive us through kind of what we have to do sometimes.
Thank you. Another question? Right here? Do we have a microphone? Yeah, it's coming from your other side.
So I came here because of Scott, because I don't really know how to define obsession, because every time I hear of something from Detroit, whether it's Bob Seger on The Voice last night, or it's going to New York and seeing Berry Gordy's Motown, or M&M or seeing you being here, I feel this obsession to go hear more about the city that I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and also, you saying that Detroit can't get any worse, well, I think it's getting better because I live in Miami. I lived in Detroit
I think I actually said it could get worse, but
Oh, it could get worse.
yeah.
Okay. Well, I lived in Detroit 25 years, and I left and moved to Miami, and then I've been here, back and forth between here and Miami. But I cannot get Detroit out of my blood. I went back there after being gone for so long and started mentoring in the Detroit schools. You know, we started a group called Women of Tomorrow to make a change in 9th through 12th grade women who are at risk. And I'm back in Cody High School. I don't know if you know Cody High School, mentoring, and they have a police station in the high school. So, I'm just trying to find, is that obsession or does everybody feel that way about their hometown? Because I feel so strong about my hometown.
I'm going to make an argument that Detroit's a little bit different. There are more Detroiters who live outside of Detroit than who live in it. It's a little bit like being Irish, maybe. And when there's a diaspora like that, you feel a kinship with the other people from that place that people from those successful cities never really feel. So, successful cities. So, yeah, there's what I found in writing this and publishing this book is that there's almost like this. I'm finding Detroiters in the weirdest places. I mean, let's face it, there are a lot in Aspen. If those of you who live here, you know this. And I think everybody's sort of rooting for Detroit, if you will. It's almost like a sporting event. And as we all know, that sort of sports, they cause obsession. I got 2 texts and an email today about the Tigers' horrible loss to the Orioles today. I mean, just all from Detroit guys, of which only one was at the game, and the others were, hundreds or thousands of miles away. But somehow they're following it as it happens in the middle of a weekday, which I don't think is all about baseball. It's like that you move away and then you root for those teams because that's your connection. I mean, I just think that people are longing for a rebirth, that renaissance that we keep waiting for. And I do agree parts of it are getting better and parts of it are pretty rough. I have friends who are volunteering at Denby High School on the east side, and just driving there is an experience, so it depends.
Any other hometown thoughts here? Pinckney, anything to say?
Yeah, I
about
mean, I've hardly ever written anything that didn't take place within about, or couldn't have taken place within about 3 miles of the place I was born. I don't, and I doubt if I write for the rest of my life, which I probably won't produce all that much, but I doubt I will ever, no matter how much I write, get outside of that very small perimeter. And every time I go there again, I see new things that I can't imagine I've missed, in my life, and new things that I want to write about, and new stories that that you think you've combed this place, and you realize, no, I mean, it's just you just haven't looked hard enough, you haven't looked close enough. So yeah, I mean, that would be an obsession, I guess, that I'll never get farther from my home than I could walk in an hour or so.
We have time for one more question. Does someone want to wrap it up here? Wait for the microphone, though.
Do you ever write about like existential obsessions that you have, that you just have to resolve something in your brain, some kind of issue, and you feel like maybe it's cathartic, that if you write this story, you'll get through it and then become, a better person or a more wise person because you've kind of worked this through, because you can't work it through any other way than through expressing it through writing or some art form?
I think if that worked, writers would be far more sane. I mean, you can try, but I don't know that it works. I think that often drives you to write something, but I don't know that it gives you an answer. What do you guys think?
Yeah, that's as well said as I could have said it.
Mm-hmm.
David,
Far better.
any thoughts?
Montaigne.
I was waiting for you to get to him.
I was pausing for you.
All right, good, yeah. I was going to
yeah,
jump
yeah.
in with the Montaigne quote, but I thought I'd give you a shot.
Montaigne said that he wrote to find out what he felt and thought, which I always thought was great. That's a different thing. Like, he knew that there were some issues that were important to him, but he wasn't sure what his opinion really was until he sat down. Nabokov, when he talks about that, what he said is feeling kind of like the heaviness of things he wanted to express, and that he would actually feel lighter, and it was a way of ceasing to care about an issue, was to produce a book about a place he lived or about a set of problems that mattered to him, and that his experience was just the only way to stop thinking about it was to get the book done and published and behind him, really, which is kind of what you were thinking about too, right?
I'd like to think you can get towards more sanity, but no, it doesn't happen.
Ain't gonna happen.
Good luck. Good luck.
Well, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for moderating. Now you know why I wasn't reading.